the train that never reached the last station. Close your eyes and settle into comfort. Let the weight of the day drift away like steam from an old locomotive, dissipating into the evening air. Tonight, we're traveling together through time, through mist, through the gossamer veil between what was and what remains. This is a story told in whispers, passed down through generations like a well-worn ticket stub, its edges soft with handling, its details both sharp and hazy in equal measure. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders drop, and allow yourself to be carried along these iron rails into a tale of mystery, longing, and the strange persistence of journeys never completed. Welcome to Hushed History, where tonight we board a train that departed long ago and, according to those who claim to have seen it, is still searching for its final destination. There's something about trains that captures the imagination in ways few other modes of transport can match. Perhaps it's their insistence on following predetermined paths, their inability to deviate from the tracks laid out before them. Or maybe it's the way they cut through landscapes, connecting distant places while creating their own isolated worlds within their carriages. Train stations have always served as liminal spaces, thresholds between departure and arrival, between goodbye and hello, between the life you're leaving and the one you're heading toward. And among all the trains that have ever run, all the journeys completed and passengers delivered safely to their destinations, there are stories of those that never arrived, locomotives that vanished between stations, and passengers who stepped aboard for journeys that would never end. Our story concerns one such train, though the exact details of when and where shift depending on who's telling it. Some place it in the autumn of 1889, others insist it was the spring of 1902, and still others claim it happened just before the Great War changed everything. The location varies too, described variously as running through the moorlands of northern England, the misty valleys of Scotland, the remote stretches of the American Midwest, or the dense forests of Central Europe. But these inconsistencies don't diminish the story. Rather, they suggest something more interesting, that perhaps this tale taps into something universal about railways and the age of steam, about journeys and destinations, about the terrible possibility that sometimes travelers get lost not in space but in time itself. Let's settle on a version, not because it's the definitive one, but because every good story needs details you can picture, landscapes you can inhabit, characters you can almost hear breathing in the seat beside you. Our train ran through the borderlands between England and Scotland, a region where mist gathers in valleys like pools of liquid silver, where ancient stones remember older names for hills and rivers, and where the coming of the railways in the mid-19th century felt both like progress and invasion. The line we're concerned with was completed in 1867, a modest branch line that connected a series of small market towns and villages, carrying farmers to market, merchants on their rounds, and the occasional traveler seeking the wild beauty of the borderlands. The railway company that operated this line was called the North Border Railway Company, a small concern that never achieved the prominence or profitability of the great railway empires of the Victorian era. The trains were second-hand even when the line opened, purchased from larger companies upgrading their stock. The carriages bore the faded livery of their previous owners, repainted in the North Border's colors of deep forest green with gold lettering, though the paint was often applied so thinly that the old colors showed through like ghosts of former identities. The locomotives were sturdy rather than elegant, built for reliability over speed, and they pulled their modest consists through the challenging terrain with determined competence if not grace. The line ran for 47 miles, beginning at Marchton in the south and terminating at Coldwell in the north. Between these endpoints lay 7 intermediate stations, each serving clusters of farms and the small towns that served as their commercial centers. The names of these places had the solid, ancient quality of the borderlands: Thornwick, Ashford Bridge, Millstream, Crowther's End, Brackenmere, Stoneford, and finally Galton, the last stop before Coldwell. The journey typically took 3 hours when conditions were good, accounting for stops at each station and the cautious speeds required on some of the more challenging stretches where the track curved around hillsides or crossed ravines on stone viaducts that had been built by hand, one stone at a time. It was on a Tuesday evening in late October when our train made its final departure from Marchton. The year, as we've settled on for this telling, was 1895, a time when Queen Victoria had reigned for nearly 60 years and the empire she ruled seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Autumn had come late that year, and the trees still held most of their leaves, though they'd turned to copper and gold, and the slanting afternoon light set them ablaze. There'd been rain earlier in the day, but it had cleared by evening, leaving the air washed clean and cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and wood smoke from cottage chimneys. The train consisted of one locomotive, a tender for coal and water, 2 passenger carriages, and a guard's van at the rear. The locomotive was a 440 design with 4 leading wheels for driving wheels and no trailing wheels, a common configuration for passenger work on smaller lines. She bore the number 17 and no name, unlike the Grand Express locomotives of the major lines that carried proud titles. The engine crew consisted of driver Thomas Wickham, 53 years old, who'd worked for the North Border since the line opened, and his fireman, a young man named James Lachlan, just 22 and still learning the trade. In the guard's van rode Albert Moss, a methodical man of 47 who kept meticulous records and had never, in 19 years of railway service, lost a piece of luggage or failed to account for a passenger. The passenger manifest that evening showed 23 souls had purchased tickets for various destinations along the line. This was a typical number for a Tuesday evening service, neither particularly busy nor unusually quiet. Among those 23 were farmers heading home after market day, their pockets lighter but hopefully their prospects brighter. There was a traveling salesman with sample cases full of household goods, making his rounds through the territory he'd worked for a dozen years. A young woman traveled alone, which was less common but not unheard of, wearing a dark blue traveling dress and carrying a small leather case, her ticket destination noted as Stoneford. An elderly couple occupied seats in the first carriage, holding hands in that unself-conscious way that speaks of decades together. A minister returning to his parish. A doctor who'd been consulting with a colleague in Marchton. 3 laborers who'd been working on repairs to a great house and were now returning to their families. A mother with 2 children, the youngest asleep in her arms. These were ordinary people on ordinary journeys, the kind that happened thousands of times a day across Britain as trains carried the country forward into what everyone believed would be an ever more prosperous and connected future. None of them could have imagined that their routine journey would become something else entirely, that they would step aboard a train one autumn evening in 1895 and never step off it again, at least not in any conventional sense. The departure from Marchton occurred precisely on schedule at 6:17 in the evening. The station master, a punctilious man named Reginald Crowe, personally checked his pocket watch against the station clock, which was itself synchronized weekly with the time transmitted by telegraph from the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. In the age of railways, time had become standardized, regulated, essential. Before the trains, each town kept its own time based on the sun's position, but the railways required coordination, timetables, precision. So when Crowe noted in his log that the 6:17 to Coldwell departed at exactly 6:17, he was documenting a small triumph of order over chaos, of modern efficiency over the loose and variable ways of the past. Driver Wickham released the brake, opened the regulator, and felt the locomotive surge forward with that particular combination of power and momentum that never failed to thrill him even after decades in the cab. The exhaust chuffed from the chimney in a steady rhythm as the train gathered speed, pulling out of Marchton Station and heading north into the gathering dusk. Fireman Lachlan fed coal into the firebox, maintaining the steam pressure at the optimal level, watching the gauges with the attention that Wickham had drilled into him. In the carriages behind, passengers settled into their seats, some reading newspapers by the gaslight that illuminated each compartment, others simply watching the countryside slide past the windows, the familiar landmarks of a journey many had made dozens of times before. The first scheduled stop was Thornwick, 7 miles north of Marchton, due at 6:32. The train arrived at 6:31, just 1 minute early, which Wickham corrected by waiting an extra minute before departing. 3 passengers disembarked at Thornwick, and 2 boarded, transactions noted in Guard Moss's records with his characteristic precision. The train departed Thornwick at 6:35 and continued north through increasingly rural country. The line here ran through rolling farmland, following the natural contours of the landscape rather than imposing straight lines upon it. The track curved around hills, passed through small woods, crossed streams on modest bridges. Through the carriage windows, passengers could see lights beginning to appear in farmhouse windows as families gathered for their evening meals. Ashford Bridge was reached at 6:49, exactly on schedule. The station here was particularly small, little more than a simple platform with a wooden shelter. Only one passenger alighted, the traveling salesman, who was met by a farmer driving a cart, presumably to convey him to wherever he was staying that night. No one boarded. Guard Moss made his notations, exchanged a brief word with the station master, and signaled to Wickham that they were clear to proceed. The locomotive's whistle sounded, a lonely call in the darkening evening, and the train moved on. Between Ashford Bridge and Millstream, the landscape began to change. The gentle farmland gave way to rougher country, with the track cutting through terrain that became progressively more challenging. Hills rose more steeply here, and the valleys between them were narrower and deeper. The North Border Railway had been forced to build several significant engineering works in this section, including 2 short tunnels and a viaduct that crossed a ravine where a swift stream rushed over rocks far below. It was beautiful country, but also slightly forbidding, especially as night fell and the civilized lights of farms became fewer and farther between. Millstream Station appeared at 7:06, and the train stopped as scheduled. This was a slightly larger station, serving a market town of about 800 souls. For passengers disembarked here, including the mother with her 2 children, Guard Moss helped them with their luggage, small acts of courtesy that made railway travel feel safer and more civilized. One passenger boarded, a man in a heavy coat carrying a walking stick, heading for Brackenmere. The transaction took 4 minutes, and the train departed at 7:10, now carrying 19 passengers toward the stations that lay ahead. The stretch between Millstream and Crowther's End was considered one of the most scenic on the entire line, at least during daylight hours. The track ran along a hillside here, offering views across a valley to the distant hills beyond. But in the darkness of an October evening, there was little to see beyond the train's own lights reflecting off the glass and the occasional glimpse of stars between passing clouds. Inside the carriages, some passengers had dozed off, lulled by the rhythmic motion and the lateness of the hour. Others continued to read or simply sat with their thoughts, watching their own reflections in the dark windows. Crowther's End station was reached at 7:24, 2 minutes ahead of schedule, which pleased Wickham. He prided himself on punctuality and was known among his colleagues as a driver who ran to time. 2 passengers left the train here, and none boarded. The station here had been built near a crossroads that served several scattered communities, but it was not near any particular town, and on a Tuesday evening there was little traffic. The station master, a solitary figure with a lantern, waved them on after Guard Moss confirmed all was in order. As the train pulled away from Crowther's End and headed into the darkness toward Brackenmere, it was carrying 17 passengers, 3 crew members, and whatever cargo the guard's van contained, which according to the manifest was primarily mail and a few parcels for delivery along the line. The time was 7:27 in the evening. Within the next 20 minutes, according to the timetable, the train should have arrived at Brackenmere Station. Within an hour, it should have reached Stoneford, and by 8:38 it should have arrived at its terminus in Coldwell, where the passengers would disembark, the crew would prepare the locomotive for its return journey the following morning, and another routine day of railway operations would conclude. But the train never reached Brackenmere. It never reached Stoneford or Galton or Coldwell. Somewhere in that stretch of track between Crowther's End and Brackenmere, in those dark miles where the railway cut through increasingly wild country, the train that departed Marchton at 6:17 on that Tuesday evening in October 1895 simply vanished. The first indication that something was wrong came at Brackenmere Station, where the station master, Henry Talbot, waited on the platform with his pocket watch in hand, growing increasingly concerned as the scheduled arrival time of 7:47 came and went with no sign of the train. Talbot was a veteran railwayman who understood that delays could happen. A mechanical issue, perhaps, or some obstruction on the line that required clearing. But he also knew that protocols existed for such situations. If a train was delayed, word would be sent ahead by telegraph. The fact that no such message had arrived troubled him. By 8 o'clock, Talbot's concern had deepened into genuine worry. He sent a telegraph message back down the line to Crowther's End, asking if the train had departed as scheduled. The response came quickly, "Yes, The train had left Crowther's End at 7:27, carrying 17 passengers, crew of 3, on time and with no reported problems. Talbot then sent messages forward to Stoneford, Galton, and Coldwell, asking if by some strange chance the train had somehow passed through Brackenmere without stopping, though he knew this was essentially impossible. The responses confirmed what he already suspected. The train had not been seen at any station north of Crowther's End. A train carrying 20 people had entered a 12-mile stretch of track and simply disappeared. The response from the North Border Railway Company was immediate and thorough. By 9 o'clock that evening, a search train had been assembled at Marchton, carrying railway officials, a doctor, and several railway police who handled security matters for the line. This train proceeded slowly north along the line, stopping at each station to gather information and continuing with extreme caution through the dark stretches between stations, the crew watching anxiously for any sign of the missing train or, worse, evidence of a wreck. They found nothing. The track between Crowther's End and Brackenmere was completely clear. There was no sign of a derailment, no evidence of any mechanical failure, no indication that a train had come to grief anywhere along that stretch. The rails themselves were intact, unbroken, showing normal wear but no damage. The telegraph wires that ran alongside the track were functioning normally. It was as if the train had simply been lifted away, leaving no trace of its passage beyond the worn rails that every train left behind. The search continued through the night and into the following day. Additional crews were dispatched, examining every inch of the 12-mile stretch with meticulous care. They checked the 2 tunnels along that section, walking through them with lanterns held high, calling out into the darkness. They examined the viaduct that crossed the ravine, looking for any sign that the train might have somehow left the rails and plunged into the valley below, though the very idea seemed impossible given the protective walls on either side of the track. They searched the woods that pressed close to the line in several places, thinking perhaps the train had somehow left the rails and crashed into the trees, though again, how this could have happened without leaving obvious evidence was inexplicable. Nothing. No train, no wreckage, no bodies, no luggage scattered by an impact. The searchers found no burnt smell that would indicate a fire, no disturbed earth that might suggest the train had somehow buried itself, no broken vegetation or damaged trees. The limestone cutting that the track passed through about 4 miles north of Crowther's End showed no marks or scrapes that would indicate a train had struck the walls. It was, in the words of one searcher, as if the train had been erased from existence, rubbed out like chalk from a board, leaving only the clean slate of the empty track behind. By the 3rd day, the search had expanded beyond the railway line itself. Volunteers from the communities along the line fanned out into the surrounding countryside, searching fields and woods, checking old quarries and abandoned mine workings, looking anywhere a train might conceivably have ended up, though no one could articulate a plausible scenario for how it might have left the rails without trace. The search parties called out names of the missing, hoping against reason that somehow survivors might be found wandering in shock through the hills. They found nothing but the ordinary countryside, unchanged and indifferent to human concerns. The families of the missing were, understandably, devastated. The small communities along the North Border Railway were tight-knit places where everyone knew everyone, and the loss of 20 people in a single incomprehensible event sent shockwaves through the region. Memorial services were held, though there were no bodies to bury, no closure to be found in the rituals that usually help the living process grief. The uncertainty was perhaps the worst part, not knowing what had happened, unable to properly mourn because some small, irrational part of the mind insisted that perhaps, somehow, the missing might still return. The North Border Railway Company faced intense scrutiny. Investigators from the Board of Trade, which oversaw railway safety, descended on the line and conducted a thorough examination of every aspect of the operation. They reviewed maintenance records, interviewed every employee, examined the track and rolling stock with exhaustive attention to detail. They looked for evidence of sabotage, mechanical failure, human error, anything that might explain the disappearance. Their final report, issued 6 months later, was remarkable for its honest admission of bafflement. They could find no cause, no explanation, no rational account for what had happened. The report concluded that the train had somehow vanished between Crowther's End and Brackenmere, and that despite the most thorough investigation possible, No evidence could be found to explain this disappearance. The North Border Railway continued operations, though the company's reputation never recovered. Passengers became nervous about traveling the line, especially through the section where the train had vanished. The company eventually sold the line to a larger railway concern, which operated it for another 30 years before abandoning it in the 1920s, when motor vehicles made the rural branch line economically unviable. The tracks were torn up during World War II, the metal salvaged for the war effort, and today much of the route has returned to nature, the careful grading work of Victorian engineers slowly being reclaimed by grass and trees. But the story of the vanished train didn't end with the line's abandonment. In fact, that's when the ghost stories really began. The first reported sighting came in the summer of 1897, less than 2 years after the disappearance. A farmer named William Grady was walking home late one evening after visiting a friend in a neighboring village. His route took him across what had been the railway line, and as he approached the old trackbed, the rails still in place then, still used daily by trains, he heard a sound that made him stop dead. It was the unmistakable chuff-chuff-chuff of a steam locomotive, growing louder, approaching from the south. Grady looked down the line and saw, to his astonishment, a train coming toward him through the twilight. The locomotive's headlamp was lit, casting a beam of light ahead of it, and Grady could see steam rising from the chimney. He could even make out the dark green livery of the North Border Railway. The train was perhaps 200 yards away when Grady saw it, approaching at what he estimated was normal speed. His first thought was simple relief. The routine of trains had been restored. Life was returning to normal after the tragedy of 1895. But then several things struck him as wrong. First, he heard no whistle, and trains always sounded their whistles when approaching crossings. Second, as the train drew closer, he realized he could see through it, just slightly, could see the landscape behind the locomotive as if the train were made of gauze or mist rather than solid iron and steel. And third, he recognized with a cold shock the number on the locomotive's side. 17, the same engine that had vanished. Grady stood frozen, unable to move, as the train approached and then passed through the spot where he stood. He felt a coldness, he later reported, like stepping into winter, and he heard sounds, not loud but clear enough to be unmistakable. The rumble of wheels on rails, the rhythmic chuffing of the engine, and something else that haunted him more than the sight of the train itself. Voices from the carriages, ordinary voices engaged in ordinary conversation, as if the passengers were simply traveling to their destinations, unaware that they'd become something other than living travelers on a real train. And then the train was past him, continuing north along the rails toward Brackenmere, toward Coldwell, toward whatever destination it was seeking. Grady watched it recede into the distance, the red lamp on the guard's van visible for a while before the whole thing faded, not suddenly but gradually, thinning like mist in sunshine until there was nothing but the empty track and the evening air and the sound of his own heart hammering in his chest. Grady's account was met with skepticism by many, attributed to imagination or perhaps too much to drink, though those who knew him insisted he was a sober and reliable man not given to fancy. But his sighting was just the first. Over the following years, dozens of people reported seeing the ghost train, always in that stretch between Crowther's End and Brackenmere, always in the evening or at night, always heading north as if still trying to complete its journey. A schoolteacher named Margaret Fenwick reported seeing it in 1903. She'd been visiting her sister in a cottage near the old railway line and was walking back after dark. The train appeared without warning, she said, emerging from the darkness like a memory made solid. She described the same details Grady had noted, the slight transparency, the absence of a whistle, the eerie quiet of its passage despite the clear sounds of operation. She also added a detail that would be repeated in many later accounts. She could see figures in the carriage windows, passengers sitting in the lamplight, reading or talking or simply staring out into the darkness, their faces pale and indistinct but clearly present. What struck Fenwick most forcefully was the sense of wrongness, a feeling that the train existed in some state that violated natural law. It looked like a train, sounded like a train, moved like a train, but it was fundamentally wrong in some way she couldn't articulate, something that made her skin crawl and filled her with a sorrow she couldn't explain. She watched it pass and felt tears on her cheeks, mourning not just the passengers aboard that phantom train but something larger, some loss that encompassed more than 20 vanished souls. In 1908, a group of railway enthusiasts who'd heard the stories decided to conduct a vigil along the Old North borderline, hoping to witness the ghost train for themselves. They positioned themselves at various points along the 12-mile stretch where sightings had been reported, equipped with notebooks and pocket watches, determined to document any appearance with scientific rigor. 3 members of the group reported seeing the train that night, all describing similar details: the dark green locomotive, the 2 passenger carriages, the guard's van, all moving north through the darkness with that characteristic otherworldly quality that marked it as something other than a normal train. One of these witnesses, a man named Thomas Pruitt who had some experience with photography, attempted to photograph the train as it passed. He set up his camera on a tripod and prepared a magnesium flash, which in that era was the only way to take photographs in low light. When the train appeared, he triggered the flash and took his photograph, the brilliant white light flooding the scene for a fraction of a second. The photograph, when developed, showed the railway line, the surrounding landscape, even a few trees near the track, but no train. Where the train should have been, there was only the empty track and the darkness beyond. This failure to capture the ghost train on film would be repeated many times over the following decades. As photographic technology improved and cameras became more common, numerous attempts were made to document the phantom train. Some of these efforts produced images that showed strange light anomalies or odd mists, but none ever captured what witnesses described seeing with their own eyes: the full train, locomotive, and carriages moving along the rails. It was as if the train existed in a frequency or wavelength that human eyes could perceive but cameras could not, as if it occupied some space adjacent to normal reality rather than fully within it. The sightings continued through the early decades of the 20th century, even after the North Border Railway ceased operations and the tracks were removed. This presented a puzzle. How could a ghost train continue to run along a railway line that no longer existed? But those who saw it reported that the train seemed to bring its own rails with it, that the trackbed beneath the locomotive and carriages appeared as it had when the line was operational, complete with rails and sleepers, only to return to its abandoned state after the train passed. It was as if the ghost train carried its own fragment of the past with it, a mobile piece of 1895 that could manifest briefly in the present before dissolving back into whatever realm it inhabited. One of the most detailed accounts came from a man named Robert Harnish, a veteran of World War I who encountered the ghost train in 1924 while hiking through what had been the railway's territory. Harnish was camping rough, traveling on foot through the border country, and had made his camp for the night near what he recognized as an old railway cutting. He'd served in the war with distinction but had come home carrying wounds that weren't physical, the kind of trauma that would later be recognized and named but in 1924 was simply called shell shock or nervous strain. He sought solace in wild places, away from crowds and noise and the demands of normal society. It was well after midnight, Harnish reported, when he heard the sound of the approaching train. His first reaction was confusion. He knew the line had been abandoned years earlier. His second reaction was something like terror, a primal response to something that shouldn't be happening. He watched from his camp as the train materialized in the cutting below him, moving through the darkness with its lights burning. Harnish had the advantage of being positioned above the train, looking down into the carriages as they passed, and what he saw stayed with him for the rest of his life. The passengers, he reported, looked entirely solid and normal, not transparent or ghostly. They were dressed in the fashions of the 1890s, which Harnish recognized from old photographs. Some were reading, some were sleeping, some were engaged in conversation. They looked like ordinary train passengers on an ordinary journey, except for one thing. They were all completely silent, and their movements had a strange quality, as if they were moving through something thicker than air, something that resisted their motion. One man was turning the pages of a newspaper, but the gesture took several seconds to complete, as if time moved differently for the passengers on the ghost train. What disturbed Harnish most was the expression on the faces of those passengers who were awake and looking out the windows. They showed no awareness of their situation, no sign that they knew they were trapped in some eternal journey. They looked like travelers do, some bored, some thoughtful, some tired, all presumably thinking about their destinations and what awaited them there. The complete normalcy of their expressions made the whole thing more unsettling somehow, the disconnect between their ordinary human concerns and the impossible situation they inhabited. Harnish watched the entire train pass, including the guard's van where he could see Guard Moss, though he didn't know the man's name at the time, making notations in what appeared to be a ledger. The same careful record-keeping he'd practiced in life now continued in whatever state he occupied. And then the train was gone, fading into the darkness toward the north, still seeking Brackenmere, still trying to complete its interrupted journey. The experience affected Harnish profoundly. He'd survived 4 years of brutal war, had seen friends killed beside him, had lived through bombardments and gas attacks and all the horrors of industrial-scale slaughter. But the ghost train shook him in a different way, opened questions about the nature of existence that he found more troubling than the certainty of mortality he'd gained in the trenches. If those passengers could be trapped in an endless journey, forever traveling toward destinations they'd never reach, what did that suggest about the possibility of being trapped in any moment, any experience, any trauma? The thought haunted him more than the actual sighting, the implication that perhaps death wasn't the worst thing that could happen to a person. Not all encounters with the ghost train were visual. Some people reported only hearing it, the sounds of its passage echoing through valleys or heard from inside buildings near the old railway line. Others reported feeling it, a sudden coldness and a sense of displacement, as if the world had briefly shifted around them. A shepherd in 1931 reported that his dogs had become agitated for no apparent reason one evening, barking and whining and refusing to be calmed, only to have the ghost train appear minutes later on the old trackbed below the field where he was gathering his flock. The dogs, he said, could apparently sense the train before it became visible, responding to something humans couldn't perceive until it manifested. There were also accounts of people who claimed to have been on or near the line when the ghost train passed and who reported experiencing strange temporal effects. Watches would stop or run backwards. Sounds would become muffled or distorted. On several occasions, witnesses reported a sense of disorientation, feeling as if they'd lost time, as if minutes or even hours had passed in what felt like moments. One woman reported in 1936 that she'd been walking her usual route home from the village shop, a journey that normally took 20 minutes, but had somehow taken over 2 hours on this particular evening, with no memory of where the time had gone. She did remember seeing a train passing in the distance, old-fashioned and somehow wrong, and when she finally arrived home, her family had been frantic with worry, on the verge of organizing a search party. The ghost train seemed to run on no set schedule. Unlike real trains, which operated with Victorian precision according to published timetables, the phantom appeared unpredictably. Sometimes months or even years would pass without a reported sighting. Then there might be a cluster of encounters within a few weeks. Researchers who studied the phenomenon, and there were several who became fascinated by the story and attempted to find patterns or explanations, could discover no correlation with dates, weather conditions, lunar phases, or any other variable they could measure. The train appeared when it would, observed by whoever happened to be in the right place at the right time, resistant to prediction or systematic study. One theory that gained some credence suggested that the train appeared more frequently during periods of personal or societal stress. Several sightings occurred during World War I and World War II, leading some to speculate that the traumatic energy of those conflicts somehow strengthened whatever force allowed the ghost train to manifest. Others reported seeing it during periods of personal crisis, after deaths in the family, during divorces, when facing serious illness. This correlation was far from perfect and might simply reflect the tendency of people undergoing stress to be more sensitive to unusual experiences, but it suggested to some that the ghost train might be connected to human consciousness in ways that a purely objective phenomenon would not be. Another recurring element in many accounts was the emotional response the train provoked in witnesses. Beyond the obvious surprise and fear of seeing something impossible, many people reported a profound sense of sadness, of grief and loss that seemed disproportionate to the experience itself. They described feeling empathy for the trapped passengers, horror at their situation, and a terrible awareness of time's passage and the way moments can extend into eternities. Some witnesses reported that seeing the ghost train changed their perspectives on life, making them more aware of mortality, more appreciative of the present moment, more conscious of how journeys we begin can take us to unexpected destinations. There were skeptics, of course, people who attributed the sightings to misidentification, imagination, folklore, or deliberate hoaxes. They pointed out that the story had become so well known in the region that people might unconsciously expect to see a ghost train and therefore interpret ambiguous experiences. A trick of the light, a distant sound, a patch of mist, as confirmation of that expectation. They noted that accounts varied in their details, sometimes significantly, suggesting the unreliability of eyewitness testimony rather than the reality of a paranormal phenomenon. They argued that the absence of photographic evidence, despite numerous attempts, essentially proved the train existed only in the minds of those who claimed to see it. But those who had witnessed the ghost train found these skeptical explanations unsatisfying. They knew what they'd seen, what they'd heard, what they'd felt. They might not be able to explain it, might not be able to prove it to others, but the experience had been real to them, had affected them in ways that simple misidentification or imagination could not account for. And there were too many witnesses, too many independent accounts from people who had no reason to lie and nothing to gain from fabricating stories, to dismiss the phenomenon entirely as mass delusion or folklore. As the 20th century progressed and the world changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the Victorians who built the North Border Railway, the sightings of the ghost train continued, though perhaps less frequently as fewer people walked the old trackbed and the landscape was transformed by development. Roads were built across the old railway route. Portions of the land were sold off for farming or forestry. The stone viaduct that the train had crossed was deliberately demolished in the 1950s, considered a safety hazard and an impediment to modern land use. The cuttings and embankments slowly eroded, their careful Victorian engineering work gradually undone by time and weather. But even as the physical traces of the North Border Railway disappeared, the story persisted. It became part of the local folklore, told in pubs and at family gatherings, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. The details became embellished over time, as such stories always do, acquiring elements that may not have been in the original accounts. Some versions claimed that the train was cursed, that it had been carrying something evil or forbidden. Others suggested that the passengers had been murdered, their souls trapped in the moment of their deaths. More romantic versions portrayed it as a tragedy of doomed love, with star-crossed lovers aboard the train, their journey interrupted by fate or malevolent forces. Yet beneath these embellishments and variations, the core story remained remarkably consistent. A rail train with real passengers had vanished in 1895, and something resembling that train continued to appear along the route where it had disappeared, still searching for its final destination more than a century after it should have arrived. In the late 1970s, a historian named Elizabeth Warrender became interested in the story and decided to conduct a thorough investigation. She spent several years researching, tracking down surviving documents from the North Border Railway Company, interviewing elderly residents who remembered stories told by their parents and grandparents, and compiling a comprehensive account of both the original disappearance and the subsequent sightings. Her book, The Train to Nowhere, The Mystery of the North Border Ghost Train, published in 1982, remains the most detailed examination of the phenomenon. Warrender's research confirmed many details of the original disappearance. She found the Board of Trade report, discovered railway company records that had survived, and located newspaper accounts from the period that documented the massive search effort and the bewilderment of the investigators. She verified the names of the passengers, crew members, and railway officials involved, turning what had become folklore back into documented history. She also documented over 60 separate sightings of the ghost train spanning from 1897 to 1981, each account carefully sourced and, where possible, corroborated. What Warrender could not do was explain the disappearance or account for the ghost train sightings in conventional terms. She explored every rational explanation she could conceive. Had the train somehow been stolen, the passengers murdered, the evidence hidden? The logistics of such a crime seemed impossible, requiring conspirators among the railway staff and the ability to dispose of a locomotive, carriages, and 20 bodies, without leaving any trace. Had there been some kind of accident? Perhaps the train had somehow fallen into an undiscovered void or sinkhole. Geological surveys of the area revealed no such features. Could the whole thing be an elaborate hoax or cover-up? But what would be the motive? And how could such a secret be maintained across generations? In the end, Warrender concluded her book with an admission of mystery. Some things, she wrote, resist explanation, Some events fall outside the boundaries of what our current understanding can encompass. That doesn't make them less real or less worthy of serious attention. The disappearance of the North Border train and the subsequent sightings of its ghost represented, in her view, a genuine anomaly, a crack in the smooth surface of rational explanation through which we glimpse something strange and unsettling about the nature of time, existence, and the persistence of unfinished journeys. Warrender's book sparked renewed interest in the story, leading to a small surge in paranormal investigators and curious tourists visiting the area, hoping to witness the ghost train for themselves. Some claimed success, reporting experiences that matched earlier accounts. Others saw nothing, spending cold nights along the old trackbed without result. The ghost train, if it existed, was not a reliable attraction, not something that could be summoned or scheduled or guaranteed to perform for an audience. One of the more intriguing recent developments in the story came in 1995, exactly 100 years after the original disappearance. Several people who had independently decided to conduct vigils along the old railway route on the anniversary of the vanishing reported seeing the ghost train, all describing similar details and all placing their sightings within the same hour on the evening of that October day. Among these witnesses was a professor of physics from Edinburgh who had come skeptical and hoping to debunk the phenomenon but instead found himself watching what he could only describe as an impossible train passing through the darkness below his position on a hillside that overlooked the old line. The professor, whose name was David Callum, wrote a lengthy article about his experience for a scientific journal, not claiming to explain what he'd seen, but rather describing it as accurately as possible and acknowledging that it challenged his understanding of physical law. He noted particularly the way the train seemed to emit light but not illuminate its surroundings in the way a normal light source would, as if the light existed only for the train itself and didn't interact with the external world in typical ways. He also noted that his electronic equipment, a video camera and a digital voice recorder, had both malfunctioned during the sighting, the camera showing only static and the recorder capturing nothing but a strange humming sound. Callum's account was significant because it came from someone with scientific credentials who had approached the phenomenon with appropriate skepticism. He made no claims about ghosts or the supernatural, but he honestly reported what he'd experienced and acknowledged that it didn't fit within conventional explanations. His willingness to document something that challenged his worldview earned him both respect and ridicule from different quarters of the academic community, but he stood by his account, insisting that unexplained phenomena deserved serious attention rather than reflexive dismissal. The centenary year also saw renewed efforts to search for any physical evidence of the original train's fate. Using modern technology including ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors, a team of volunteers and researchers conducted a systematic survey of the 12-mile stretch between Crowther's End and Brackenmere. They were looking for any buried evidence, metal from the train, remains of passengers, anything that might have been overlooked in the original searches. Century earlier, they found nothing. The ground beneath what had been the railway line showed no anomalies that would suggest a buried train or mass grave. The ravine beneath the old viaduct was thoroughly searched again, using modern climbing equipment to access areas that might have been too dangerous for Victorian searchers. Nothing. It was as if the train had indeed simply vanished, leaving no trace beyond the memories of those who'd last seen it at Crowther's End station and the persistent reports of its ghost continuing to run through the borderlands. In trying to understand what might have happened, some researchers turned to theoretical physics and ideas about the nature of time and space. Could the train have somehow slipped through a fold in spacetime, emerging elsewhere or else when? The concept of wormholes and dimensional rifts, once purely science fiction, had gained a degree of scientific respectability through advances in theoretical physics. While there was no evidence that such phenomena could actually occur at human scales or in uncontrolled conditions, the mathematics suggested they might be theoretically possible. Could the train have encountered some kind of natural anomaly, a brief opening to elsewhere that swallowed it whole and left no trace? Such explanations have the virtue of accounting for the complete absence of wreckage or remains while also potentially explaining the ghost sightings. Perhaps what people were seeing was the train caught in some kind of temporal loop, replaying its final journey again and again, visible from normal spacetime but not fully present in it. This would explain why the train couldn't be photographed, why it didn't interact with the environment in normal ways, why it seemed to bring its own rails with it and existed in a state that violated ordinary physics. Of course, these explanations are themselves highly speculative, pushing theoretical concepts far beyond what the physics actually supports. They're really just sophisticated ways of saying we don't know, of giving a scientific-sounding frame to mystery. But they at least acknowledge that the phenomenon, if real, must involve processes or principles that current science doesn't fully understand, which is perhaps more honest than simply dismissing all the accounts as mistakes or fabrications. Others approach the mystery from a more philosophical or metaphysical angle, suggesting that the ghost train represented something about the nature of journeys themselves, about intention and destination. The passengers on that October evening in 1895 had been traveling with purpose, heading toward homes and loved ones and lives that awaited them. Their journeys had been interrupted, their intentions unfulfilled. Perhaps what manifested as the ghost train was in some sense their collective will to complete those journeys, a psychic imprint or residue that persisted because the interruption had been so complete and so traumatic. This interpretation treats the ghost train as something like a recording, a pattern impressed on the landscape by the intensity of the event and the emotional energy involved. Just as trauma can create lasting psychological scars, perhaps extreme events can leave marks on places, patterns that can occasionally replay when conditions are right. This view doesn't require believing in souls or spirits in the traditional sense, but it does suggest that consciousness or intention might interact with the physical world in ways that conventional materialism doesn't account for. Such ideas bring us into territory where science, philosophy, and folklore blend together, where precise explanations give way to metaphor and speculation. But maybe that's appropriate for a phenomenon that has consistently resisted empirical investigation while remaining stubbornly persistent in human experience. The ghost train exists, if it exists at all, in that liminal space between the documented and the imagined, the real and the mythical, the physical and the psychological. What's certain is that the story has had a lasting impact on the region and on those who've engaged with it. The Old North Border Railway, which during its brief operational life was just another minor branch line serving rural communities, has achieved a kind of immortality through its mysterious end. People who've never heard of the line's routine operations know about the train that vanished and the ghost that haunts the route where it disappeared. The story has inspired artists and writers, musicians and filmmakers. There have been paintings depicting the ghost train emerging from mist, novels that use the disappearance as a central mystery, folk songs that lament the lost passengers, and documentary films that explore the various theories and accounts. The image of a Victorian train running forever through the darkness, trapped between departure and arrival, resonates as a powerful metaphor for various aspects of human experience. For journeys interrupted, for lives caught in transition, for the way the past can persist and haunt the present. For the families of those who disappeared in 1895, the story was primarily one of loss and grief, of mourning complicated by the absence of bodies and clear explanations. Their pain was real and immediate, not metaphorical. The passengers on that train were loved ones, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, friends and neighbors. Their disappearance left holes in families and communities that could never be properly filled. As the decades passed and the last people who'd personally known the vanished passengers died themselves, the story became less about specific individuals and more about the universal experience of unexplained loss. Today, more than a century and a quarter after that October evening in 1895, occasional sightings of the ghost train still occur. They're less frequent now, or perhaps just less frequently reported as people become more hesitant to share experiences they know will be met with skepticism. But every few years, someone will report seeing an old-fashioned train passing through the darkness in a place where no trains run, or hearing the distinctive sounds of a steam locomotive where no tracks remain. The landscape itself has changed almost beyond recognition from what the passengers aboard the last train would have known. The small agricultural communities they were traveling between have either grown into larger towns or dwindled into near abandonment as economic forces reshaped rural life. The hills and valleys remain, of course, shaped by geological timescales that make human concerns seem brief and insignificant. But the human geography has been transformed, the pattern of fields and roads and buildings altered by more than a century of continuous change. Yet somewhere in that landscape, according to those who claim to have seen it, a train from 1895 continues its interrupted journey, carrying passengers who set out for destinations they expected to reach before nightfall and instead found themselves trapped in an eternal transit. Whether this represents some genuine paranormal phenomenon, some trick of geology and psychology that creates convincing illusions, or simply the power of a good story to persist and transform in the telling, the ghost train has become a permanent part of the region's identity. There's a small museum in what was Marchton, now a considerably larger town than the Victorian village it once was, that maintains a display about the North Border Railway and the mystery of the vanished train. The display includes photographs of the original stations, artifacts from the railway's operation, and documentation of both the 1895 disappearance and the subsequent ghost sightings. Among the items on display is the actual passenger manifest from that final journey, showing the names of the 23 people who boarded at Marchton or intermediate stations, their destinations noted in the careful handwriting of a Victorian railway clerk. Looking at those names, Thomas Wickham, James Lachlan, Albert Moss, and the 17 passengers whose individual stories we can now barely reconstruct, it's striking how ordinary they were. These weren't famous people or powerful individuals whose disappearances would shake nations. They were common folk engaged in the everyday business of life, traveling modest distances for unremarkable reasons. The salesman with his sample cases, the mother with her children, the elderly couple holding hands, the young woman in the dark blue traveling dress heading to Stoneford for purposes we can no longer determine. Their ordinariness makes their fate more unsettling somehow. If they could vanish so completely, if a routine train journey could end in such inexplicable circumstances, then what security do any of us have? We make plans, we purchase tickets, we board trains or planes or simply walk out our doors, assuming we'll reach our destinations, that the journey will unfold as expected. The story of the North Border train reminds us that this assumption, while usually valid, is not guaranteed. Sometimes people set out and don't arrive, and sometimes there's no explanation, no closure, no final chapter that makes sense of what came before. The ghost train, in this reading, becomes a monument to uncertainty, to the limits of knowledge and control. Its eternal journey is a journey we all undertake in some sense, moving through time toward destinations we hope to reach but cannot guarantee. We're all passengers on trains that might or might not arrive, and perhaps that's why the story resonates, why it's persisted for so long and touched so many people who have no direct connection to the original event. Of course, another interpretation is possible. Perhaps the ghost train, if it exists at all, represents hope rather than doom. Perhaps those passengers, trapped in their endless journey, are at least still together, still moving forward, still animated by the intention to reach home. Perhaps they're frozen not in despair but in the ordinary contentment of travelers who expect to arrive, preserved in a moment before they knew anything was wrong. There are worse fates than being trapped in a moment of anticipation, of journey rather than arrival. At least they're still moving, still progressing toward something, even if they never quite get there. The border country where all this occurred has a long history of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena, or at least a tradition of stories about such things. The borderlands between England and Scotland have always been liminal spaces, contested territories where allegiances shifted and boundaries blurred. There are tales of ghosts and fairies, of mysterious lights and strange creatures, of places where time flows differently and the walls between worlds grow thin. The ghost train fits into this tradition, becoming another strand in the tapestry, in the fabric of border folklore. But unlike most folklore, which deals with events from the distant past that can neither be confirmed nor denied, the ghost train story has one foot firmly in documented history. We know the train existed, know it vanished, have the official reports and newspaper accounts to prove it. This grounds the supernatural elements in reality in a way that makes them more difficult to dismiss. When someone reports seeing a fairy, we can attribute it to imagination or folklore or misidentification. But when they report seeing a specific train that historically vanished under mysterious circumstances, the phenomenon demands a different kind of attention. The intersection of documented fact and unexplained phenomenon creates a peculiar kind of story, one that exists simultaneously in multiple registers, as history, as mystery, as folklore, as possible paranormal event. The ghost train is all of these things at once, and perhaps that multiplicity is part of its enduring appeal. It offers something for everyone, a historical puzzle for those interested in Victorian railways, a supernatural mystery for believers in ghosts, a case study in folklore and legend for anthropologists, a philosophical question about the nature of time and existence for those inclined towards such contemplation. As we've traveled through this story together, moving from the documented departure at Marchton through the vanishing somewhere north of Crowther's End and forward through decades of ghost sightings and theories and speculations, we've traced a journey that mirrors the ghost train's own eternal transit. We've departed from the solid ground of historical fact, passed through increasingly mysterious territory, and arrived at, well, we haven't quite arrived, have we? We're still in transit, still moving toward understanding but never quite reaching it, much like the train itself, forever heading toward Coldwell but never pulling into that final station. And perhaps that's where we should leave it, suspended between knowing and not knowing, between the documented past and the reported present, between skepticism and wonder. The ghost train asks us to hold uncertainty lightly, to acknowledge that not everything resolves into clear explanations, that some mysteries persist not because we're too ignorant or unobservant to solve them, but because they may be genuinely inexplicable given our current understanding. On quiet evenings in the border country, when mist gathers in the valleys and the old trackbed is just visible as a slight depression in the landscape, some people still watch and listen, hoping or perhaps fearing to see that old-fashioned train emerge from the darkness. Most see nothing, hear nothing, experience nothing unusual. But occasionally someone reports that they've witnessed it, that the ghost train has made another appearance, still running its eternal route, still carrying its complement of passengers toward destinations they departed for in 1895 and have been traveling toward ever since. Whether these reports represent genuine paranormal phenomena, elaborate hoaxes, misidentifications, or the power of suggestion and expectation, they keep the story alive. The ghost train continues to run, at least in human consciousness and conversation, and maybe that's a kind of existence in itself. Stories, after all, have their own reality, their own persistence. They travel through time as surely as any train, carrying meanings and memories and questions from generation to generation. The passengers aboard the last train from Marchton on that October evening in 1895 surely had no idea they were about to become part of a legend that would outlast the railway they traveled on by more than a century. They were just people going home, making routine journeys they'd probably made dozens of times before. But somewhere in those dark miles north of Crowther's End, their ordinary journey transformed into something extraordinary, something that would be remembered and discussed and puzzled over long after the physical railway that carried them had returned to earth and grass. If they could know this, would it comfort them or disturb them? Would they feel honored to be remembered? Or would they simply wish to complete their journeys, to step off the train at Brackenmere or Stoneford or Galton or Coldwell, and walk home to lives that awaited them? We can't know, of course. We can't know what they experienced in those final moments before the train vanished. Can't know if they suffered or passed without awareness from one state of existence to another. Can't know if some part of them truly does persist aboard a phantom train, or if that's just a story we tell ourselves to make sense of an event that may have been simply tragic and meaningless. What we can know is that their story has become part of our collective memory, part of the way we think about journeys and disappearances, about the past and its persistence, about the thin line between the world we can measure and document and the world that seems to exist just beyond our grasp. The ghost train runs in that liminal space, seen by some and not by others, real to those who witness it and imaginary to those who don't, forever trapped or forever journeying depending on how you choose to interpret it. And so we come to the end of our own journey through this story, though like the ghost train itself, perhaps there's no true ending, just a pause, a station where we disembark while the train continues on. The mystery remains unsolved, the questions unanswered. The ghost train still running somewhere in the borderlands, still carrying its passengers through the endless night toward morning and arrival and home. If you found yourself drawn into this tale, captivated by the mystery of those vanished passengers and the train that may or may not still seek its final destination, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Hushed History. We're a community of people who appreciate the quiet mysteries, the unexplained phenomena that don't scream for attention but whisper from the margins of history and experience. There are so many more stories to explore together, so many more journeys to take through the borderlands between known and unknown. And perhaps, on some quiet evening when you're traveling through unfamiliar territory, You'll hear a distant sound like a train passing in the night, see a light moving through darkness where no trains run, feel a coldness and sense of displacement that suggests something other than the ordinary world pressing close. If that happens, remember the passengers who departed Marchton in 1895, still traveling after all these years, and wonder whether time and space are quite as solid and reliable as we generally assume them to be. Until our next journey together into hushed history, sleep well, dream deeply, and may all your travels reach their intended destinations, unlike that train that departed one autumn evening so long ago and, if the stories are true, is still trying to complete its interrupted journey, still carrying its passengers through the darkness, still heading north through the borderlands, still seeking the station it never reached.